Hi there everyone, hope you're doing well. This video is going to start our first topic about games by trying to investigate, well, what does it even mean for something to be a game? But instead of trying to give a definition right away, we're actually going to look at a challenge to this very project of trying to define games. So in the video, we're going to start out by reviewing this idea of conceptual analysis, and this will lead into Wittgenstein's challenge to the very project of giving conceptual analyses of ideas or concepts or words. Now, this will lead into a discussion of Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances and his approach to how we should try to understand ideas or words or language. So remember, in the previous video, we introduced this method of conceptual analysis where we try to clarify and better understand an idea using the following process. We identify a target concept. So this is the thing we're trying to understand, we're trying to explain. Maybe we're trying to understand or explain knowledge or free will or the difference between right and wrong. Well, here, since we're trying to investigate games, we might want to try to clarify, well, what do we mean by games? And so now that we have our target or our idea, we can try to get a better understanding of that concept by analyzing it and breaking it down into smaller, simpler parts. But the goal here is to come up with these simpler ideas where each of them by themselves is necessary for the thing we're trying to analyze. So in this case, a game. So what is necessary for something to be a game? But we also want the conditions to be sufficient. We want to find all the information we need to explain what a game is. But now this brings us to the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein is an extremely influential philosopher and intellectual from the first half of the 20th century. Now, one of his most famous and well-known works is his posthumous philosophical investigations. So Wittgenstein in this work introduces the idea of a language game, and he uses this in an attempt to better explain to us what a language is and how it works. As you might guess, he's making an analogy here between what we do with language and playing various kinds of games. But of course, if you're going to try to explain the idea of a language using the analogy to games, well, you might wonder, well, don't you need to tell us what games are if that's going to illuminate how we should think about language? And so at one point, this leads Wittgenstein into a discussion about games more generally. And this short discussion about games has actually been pretty influential. Before turning to his discussion of games, though, I think it's important that we contextualize that discussion a little bit by considering some of the overall goals that he had in this philosophical investigations, this book here. Now, Wittgenstein poses a worrisome challenge to the very method of conceptual analysis, not just to giving a conceptual analysis of games, but to giving any kind of conceptual analysis of any idea. So Wittgenstein is attempting to show that this very method of conceptual analysis can't work because it's built on some mistaken assumptions about how the human mind works and about how human language works. One of the mistakes he thinks it makes is that it wrongly assumes that language gets its meaning by creating a kind of metaphorical picture that represents things in the world around us. Now, you can try to understand this view about language by maybe thinking about the example of color. We all have the idea of redness and greenness. This word is meaningful to us. You can close your eyes and you can think about the idea of redness. But what is it that gives that idea or that word meaning? Now, maybe you think what makes that word meaningful is that when I say it, a kind of picture pops into your mind. That picture that thereby represents the color out there in the world, that's what gives the word meaning. Now, related to this is this view that our ideas or words categorize things by picking out something specific that those things have in common, that captures this essence or nature of that kind of thing. So let's think about that word red again. Well, there's lots of different kinds of redness. There's cherry red, there's scarlet red, there's crimson red, there's maroon, there's lots of shades of red. But you might think the meaning of the word red is not any one particular shade. The meaning of the word red, you might think, is this general idea that captures what all of those shades have in common. Related to this is this view that our mind understands an idea or term by grasping some definition, getting that definition in front of our mind. And once we have that definition in our mind, we can thereby identify things by recognizing that they meet the relevant definition. So I get the picture of the redness before my mind, and then because I have that picture in front of my mind, I can look at my desk and notice that what I see, the color I see on my desk, matches or corresponds to this picture that I have in my mind when I think about the idea of redness. I am thereby able to recognize that my desk is red. Maybe you hear this and you're like, oh yeah, that sounds like a pretty good explanation for what language is and how it works. But this is what Wittgenstein thinks is mistaken. He thinks these ideas about what language is and how it works are wrong. And so this leads us to his discussion on games. Wittgenstein uses the example of a game, at least partly, to challenge that common view about our mind and language. And so Wittgenstein says, consider the activities that we call game. So he brings up the example. I mean, board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. So he gives some examples of the various things he means. He says, well, what's common to them all? So notice this is a kind of request to tell me, well, what is this definition that allows you to understand what these things are, that gets at the essence of these things? But then he goes on to say, don't say there must be something in common, or they would not be called games. You might be thinking, well, look, it's really hard to say exactly what all these things have in common, but if we call them all the same thing, it must be because there's something similar between them all. Well, that's just to assume that language works in a specific way. It doesn't actually show that that's how it is. Just if you want to understand how language works, if you want to understand how the idea of games has meaning, you need to look at these examples and see whether there really is anything common to them all. Don't just assume that there is. When he does this, he says, look, for example, at board games with their multifarious relationships. So these, just look at board games by themselves. There's lots of things that they have in common. But now let's go to other things we call games. Card games, things where there's no board, for instance. Now here, he says, you find many correspondences with the first group. So you might find a lot of similarities between some card games and board games. But many of the common features that we saw between board games are now gone. And now as we move to card games, we might also have new similarities between card games that we didn't notice between board games. It says, and now when we pass next to ball games rather than card games, there's much that is common that's retained yet again, but a lot of things that were similar between card games are no longer present when we consider the case of ball games. So we notice that there are all these similarities at each of the steps, but they keep changing what those similarities are. Where can we find the similarities that are not just present between card games and ball games, or between card games and board games, but between all of these examples? Wittgenstein says, well, is it that just all of these things are amusing or entertaining? But a problem with this is, well, there's lots of things that aren't games that are also amusing. I mean, comedy is amusing, is entertaining, but you don't say that comedy is a game. Similarly, it's not clear that games are amusing in the same sense. The way that chess is entertaining to us is not the same way that tic-tac-toe is. Similarly, some games, we might enjoy them because of the way in which they exercise skill. But notice the kind of skill we exercise in chess is very different than the kind of skill we exercise in playing basketball. And some games involve a lot of skill, but some games involve a lot of luck, and we enjoy them because of the luck and not because of the skill that we're exercising. And so the sense in which games are amusing seems to be very different. And so it's not clear that by calling them all amusing or entertaining, we really get at anything specific that is common between them all. There's another suggestion. Maybe you want to say that games always involve competition between players. But the problem here is that this just isn't true. He brings up the example of solitaire. So this is a card game that you play by yourself. Video games, a lot of them are things that you play by yourself rather than with others without competing against others. Another problem here is that there's many things that we wouldn't initially think of as games that also have competition between people. So when people run for governmental office, they are competing against others for that spot in the government as president or congressperson, for instance. But we don't think of politics as a literal game. And so it looks like competition between people can't really be what defines a game. Here's another suggestion. Maybe it's that games always involve winning and losing. Even if you don't play against another player, well, in solitaire, when you play that card game, you either win this game solo or you lose the game solo. When you play a video game, you might win that game, or you might lose when you run out of lives, for instance. A problem with this, though, is that not all games involve winning and losing. Imagine a child wants to go outside and play a game of catch with their parent. Or imagine a child that plays a game just by throwing a wall against the ball and trying to catch it. There's no winning, they're just going back and forth seeing how long they can do it. Or imagine children playing games like playing house. You don't win when you play house. Or imagine Ring Around the Rosie. Or an alphabet brainstorm road trip game. So this is one that me and my family play sometimes, where we pick a category, like animals, and then we try to work together to come up with an example of an animal that starts with A. So we say aardvark, and then we go to B, and we come up with beluga whale. And then we go to C, try to come up with something. The key here is there's no really winning or losing. We're just going through and playing, coming up with these things. Or imagine certain kinds of video games. It's not clear that there's anything such as winning and losing in Tetris, especially when you play by yourself. You're just challenging yourself to see how far you can go. Or consider the video game Animal Crossing. This is a Nintendo video game where you're building up a society, you're just building a house, trying to garden, etc. But there's no such thing as winning Animal Crossing. You're just building an island, making money and buying things and creating your town, adding businesses, but there's no winning state that you're moving towards, and there's no such thing as losing it either. And so all of these examples seem to show that games can't be understood in terms of whether there's winning or losing. Now notice here, what Wittgenstein is doing is giving counterexamples to show that when people propose these things as definitive of games, well, these things aren't really necessary, or they actually aren't sufficient for something being a game. Wittgenstein is giving counterexamples to show that the relevant conditions don't actually define what it is to be a game. What should we think when we run into all these counterexamples to these proposals for how to understand what a game is? One reaction is you might say, well, look, there's got to be something that they have all in common, otherwise we wouldn't call each and every one of them a game. But maybe we just haven't figured out what that thing is that they have in common yet. We just haven't found the right definition yet. But remember Wittgenstein's suggestion here. He says, don't just assume that there's got to be something in common. Look at the examples. Look and see, observe them, and try to find any kind of similarity that's common to all. And so Wittgenstein's reaction isn't that, hey, there's some definition, we just haven't found it. His reaction is to say, the lesson here is that there just isn't a set of conditions that's common to all and only games, and so it's impossible to give that kind of definition. It's impossible to give a conceptual analysis that identifies that single list of conditions that's going to characterize all games. But if that's the case, if there's nothing that they all have in common, what does it even mean for something to be a game? How does that term have any kind of meaning for us to understand? Wittgenstein says, look, if you want to know what a game is, if you look at them, you won't see something that's common to all of them. And so that single commonality isn't what makes them a game. Instead, when you look and see, what you notice is there are similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them. And the result of this examination is we see a complicated network of similarities. So there's not one single thing that's similar between all. I can see similarities between two things over here, and that thing is similar to that other one over here, and that thing is similar to this other thing over here. I see like this complicated web of similarities connecting all the things we see games, but there's not one single thread going through all of them, so to speak. He says, I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, etc., overlap and crisscross in the same way. And I shall say games form a family. So the idea here is what a game is, what it means for something to be a game, is just for it to belong to this family of all these different overlapping similarities. It doesn't mean that there's one single essence that all these things share. In the same way, I belong to the Taylor family. Now, what is it that makes me belong to the Taylor family? It's not because there's this one thing that I share with everybody in the Taylor family. There's not any single thing that my dad, my mom, me, my brother, my sister, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my great-grandparents, there's no single thing that all of us share. Instead, there's just this complicated web of similarities, and similarly, what makes something a game is just that it's a member of this family of all these overlapping, crisscrossing similarities. Now, our focus in this course is on games, and so we're focusing on these specific comments on games from Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein really here wasn't really making a point specific to games. He was making a larger point about language and our minds and the way we understand things more generally. So we're not going to dive into very difficult interpretation of Wittgenstein and some of the more complicated theories, but I do want to stress a couple themes that we get from these philosophical investigations. One of these themes is that, according to Wittgenstein, the meaning of a word is not given by how it pictures or represents reality. Instead, the meaning of a word is given by its use. Let's consider an example of this. Wittgenstein says, well, imagine someone says to me, show the children a game. And I teach them gambling with dice. And the person comes back and says, I didn't mean that sort of game. Must the exclusion of the game with dice have come before his mind when he gave me the order? The idea here is, look, when he says, show the children a game, obviously the word game has some kind of meaning as he uses it. Does what they mean by that word come from them having some picture in their mind that excludes this gambling game? Or is it just that it didn't mean that because that's not the way they're using the game now? And the fact that they're not using it that way, even if they didn't have this picture before their mind, it's the use of that word that gives it that meaning. Now, this leads into some other themes here. According to Wittgenstein, the meanings of our words are not determined by precise and general commonalities that set determinate boundaries for when that word does and does not apply. Building on this, Wittgenstein says one might say that the concept game is a concept with blurred edges. For instance, it doesn't seem like our idea of the color red has any sharp boundaries. It's a blurred concept. At what point does redness stop being red and start becoming orange? Wittgenstein is saying that's how it is with all of our words and ideas. There's no sharp boundary that distinguishes between games and not games. It's a blurred concept. Now he brings up this worry. Well, if it's a blurred concept, if there's no set boundaries of the difference between a game and not a game, well, is that really a concept? Is that really an idea of anything at all? But then he says, well, of course not. And he gives an example. He says, is it really senseless to say, stand roughly there? Suppose that I were standing with someone in a city square and said that. As I say it, I do not draw any kind of boundary, but perhaps point with my hand. The idea is, the way that I use this allows that other person to understand what I mean. They're able to use it. It's able to serve its purpose. And the fact that it's able to serve its purpose is what gives it its meaning. As we've seen, the meanings of words on Wittgenstein's view comes from these overlapping similarities or this family resemblances that are involved in these various different kinds of usages. Wittgenstein also says this can be seen in how we learn or teach language. He says, how should we explain to someone what a game is? We want to get them to understand this idea. He says, I imagine that we should describe games to him. So we shouldn't give them a definition. We should just describe actual examples of games. And then we might add, well, this and similar things are called games. Now, someone might worry, though, that if the concept game is uncircumscribed like that, well, then you don't really know what you mean by a game. And he goes on to say, well, this is just how one might explain to someone what a game is. One gives examples and intends them to be taken in a particular way. I do not, however, mean by this that he's supposed to see in those examples that common thing which I was unable to express, but that he is now to employ those examples in a particular way. So the idea here is, look, when we teach someone, when we try to help them understand what a game is, we don't just give them a definition and say, that's what a game is. Instead, usually if someone really has no idea what a game is, I give them examples and I describe what you do in that particular game. Then after they understand that example of a game, I say, well, that's a game, and things that are similar to that are also a game. As I do more and more of these examples, it's not that they notice something that is common to all of these cases. Rather, they just become familiar with these different ways of using this term. And as they gain that ability to use the word in those various ways, having those abilities to use it those ways, that just is what it is to understand this idea. They don't need to have any definition before their mind. So given what Wittgenstein has said about games and language, we might start just to wonder, well, where do we go from here? Well, we need to think, well, is he actually right about these things? Is he right that we can't give a definition of games, at least in this conceptual analysis sense of trying to give necessary and sufficient conditions? And is he right that the meaning of language is generally determined by various usages and never by any clearly prescribed or determinate definitions? Now remember, Wittgenstein himself says, well, to answer these questions, we just need to look and see. Consider examples and see, can you actually find any commonalities between all of them? But one thing I want to stress here is Wittgenstein's own attempt to look. He does bring up examples, but it seems to be rather brief and superficial. Like he only says, well, look, maybe there's enjoyment, or maybe it's winning and losing. Like those accounts of what it is that makes them games, they don't really seem to try to dive into any kind of like underlying complexity to these things. Now, maybe he's right. Maybe even if we do this more deep dive into the intricacies of games, we won't find any commonalities between them all that would be able to define them in this conceptual analysis sense. But maybe he's wrong. Maybe he's wrong about language more generally. But I want to suggest that whether he's right or wrong, it still seems like good advice to look and see, as he says. We should consider examples and we should try to do a deeper dive into the complexities there to try to attend to whether or not we can find any commonalities between them all. This attempt to try to find those commonalities between all of those looks like it could be helpful for getting a better understanding of what games are, regardless of whether an understanding of games would come in the form of a definition of necessary and sufficient conditions, or in terms of gaining the ability to talk about games in the right kind of ways, because when either we'll figure out some commonalities between them all, or if we don't, well, by considering all the counterexamples as we learn that, notice we are learning about how we use the word game. And so that's where we're going to go next. The next couple readings and videos are hopefully going to help you give a better perspective on what kind of games there are, how they've developed throughout history, so we have more examples to deal with and we can look at more specific details to try to come up with and see if there really is anything common to them all. And if there isn't, if we can't find anything common, we'll at least learn more about the different ways we might use this language to talk about games. All right, so I'll see you all then. Bye-bye.